Hello, everybody. We're on to our next little section of development, and we're going to go into social emotional. There's going to be two parts. The first one is going to be about attachment. All right, so we're going to start there. So, first up topic is going to be attachment, and so attachment has different categories, and I just want you guys to just put it like in numbers because these are just basically different components of what is attachment. All right, so we're gonna start with the first one, which is stranger anxiety, and this is developed about 8 months after they've developed object permanence, right? Which object permanence is knowing that even though they're not there, we cannot see it, that they still exist, okay? So during stranger anxiety, what tends to occur is that when a child is greeted with a stranger, they tend to start crying, they're more self-protective, and they reach for a familiar caregiver, okay? This is when they already have built schemas with familiar faces. Sometimes you will see babies that a little bit younger than 8 months that start crying with people that tend to have a little bit different facial features than their parents or caregivers. During this time, they cannot typically assimilate to new faces into those schemas of the faces that they do remember. So they cannot really assimilate. Over time, they start accommodating, okay, to realize like the differences, okay? Second part of attachment is going to be attachment, bonding slash theory, okay? And this started with John Bowlby, his name is there. And attachment bond is this idea of that they're grasping for physical attachment to the caregiver, okay, which is very important for development, not just physical development, but also cognitively, okay? And then he basically stated in his attachment theory was that attachment behavior is something that is innate in babies and in human beings. That babies, some of the behaviors that they exhibit are raising their arms to be picked up when they're distressed or wanting that comfort in order for like any stressful situations, okay? Then we go into the next study, a very important study when it comes to attachment, which was by this guy named Harry Harlow. You need to know this, okay? His name. And here's his little monkeys. He did an experiment with these little monkeys on the importance of attachment, okay? And in this study, what he did was that he basically separated the infant monkey from the mother and placed them into this cage, okay? And in the cage, they had two kind of artificial moms, right? So if you see here, this is going to be the mother here that was warm and fuzzy, but had no food. And then here, not sure you could see, notice, but here is going to be another, like the mother that had the food and the nutrients. And what in the study, okay, and I'm hoping you're writing this down. I'm going fast because I want you guys to be pausing as we go. But what ended up in this study was that what he found out that the monkey, what it tend to hang out and go to the mom monkey that had the cloth and was warm, and it only went to the mother that had the nutrients, the milk, only when it was hungry. And the minute that he left, that it was done feeding, it would go directly to the mother that was warm. So this study was really, really important because it showed the importance of the physical attachment and the comfort that a person needs, babies especially need. And it just can't be a caregiver that just gives food, right? Like that. We as human beings also need that physical connection because like I've said many, many times, we are physical beings that need to be with other humans, right? And it's very important, our connection, okay? So that's our study with Harry Harlow. Definitely always going to be in there. He's a significant person of when it comes to attachment. Okay, so then they go into next little section I want you to write is what's called familiarity and imprinting. Okay, and what they found under here was basically that attachment is based on familiarity that is formed during what's called the critical period. Okay, now critical period is what it means is it is an optimal period in which certain events must take place to facilitate its proper development. Okay, so what they're saying is that this attachment with the caregiver and the child, the baby, is there is some form of critical period that it is crucial to have. Now, please make sure to write this down. Critical periods, we don't have a lot of critical periods when it comes to human beings. Two of the main ones is, and definitely need to know this, is going to be the language, okay, and then attachment. And what they basically say is that if these things are not established during these critical moments, period, that it is harder for them to fully develop these skills later on in life, okay? Now, one of the most important studies in psychology that was created during this familiarity and imprinting is this study with imprinting. It's called imprinting, and we have the guy's name with him that you need to know is Konrad Lorenz, which is basically this dude right here, and the ducks. That's what you need to know. Imprinting. And imprinting is the process in which certain animals form a strong attachment during an early life, right? And ducks, what he found out was that ducks have this critical period with imprinting, which is basically the attachment, right? Now, the thing is that children don't necessarily have imprinting to become attached, but it's still a significant period in which children need to develop that attachment during that time. So what this study basically just showed was the importance of creating an attachment as they're younger. The only thing is that what they're saying is that humans don't necessarily have imprinting, which is that specific like a short amount of time that needs for to be attached. Okay, what they did find out is that mere exposure, right? We've seen that word many times. Mere exposure is that the more you're exposed to a person, the more attachment or fondness can occur with that person. Okay, so that's very important when it comes to attachment. Okay, now we're going to go on to the next stage, which is basically how and I'm not sure if you guys have heard, but it's kind of like the big thing now in psychology, is the different attachment styles, okay? And it really started with this lady called Mary Ainsworth. And she did this experiment called the Strange Situation Experiment. Now, you need to understand how this experiment went, and I have a chart here that I want you guys to understand what ended up happening. Okay, so Mary Ainsworth wanted to know how is it that, depending on the attachment of the caregiver with the child, of how are children going to act in a strange situation with strangers or by themselves or when they're in an environment solo. Okay, so this is how it went. It was about 3 minutes each of these interactions. So what ended up happening was first interaction, they're in a room, and I'm gonna scroll here so you could kind of see how that occurs, okay? And so what ends up happening, and maybe I'll just leave it like that and you guys can pause the video to write it down. But basically what happens is that the mother goes in, right? The mother goes in with the stranger. They're in the room with the baby, okay? Takes a couple seconds, the observer, right, the research or the stranger, I just call it the stranger, the mom and the child. So they go into this room and they start playing. The mother and the child stay in the room by themselves, playing and participating. This is a good way for the researcher to observe how the mother interacts with the child and what type of attachment style they have. Okay, so then what ends up happening is the stranger comes into the room and then sees how they start interacting with each other. The stranger's quiet. Then what happens is the mother leaves. Okay, and then they observe to see how the baby reacts. So the stranger and the infant are by themselves. Then the mother comes back, and then they're looking to see how the baby reacts when the mom comes back into the room. And then they also leave the child by themselves, and then they'll leave. Then the stranger comes in with the infant, and then to see how the baby interacts with them. And then the last thing is the mother comes back for the infant, and then they record to see how the parent or how the child responds to the mom coming back. Okay, so what she discovered was basically, and you do need to know what this experiments, how they did that. And what they found out was this, and this is what you need to know what ends up happening, is that they found there are, by the way, by this point, like I think every year they've added more attachment styles. And so this is what you need to know for each one. You need to know this chart, okay? And what she found was that a parent and a child that has a secure attachment, what ends up happening is during the separation, the child is distressed when the mom leaves, okay? When the stranger comes in, the child tends to avoid the stranger, but over time starts getting or wait, we'll go back to that. The stranger, they are avoidant of the stranger, and then when the mom comes back or when the mom is there, they tend to be more positive, interactions with the stranger. They're okay with interacting with the stranger. When the mom comes back into the room, it's important. The reunion behavior is the child is happy. They're super glad the mom is there. Okay. And then when the mom is present, you notice that the child feels safe. Okay. And what she found is about 70% of infants felt this way or responded to the mom in this situation. Okay, then we go on to the next one, and I do want you guys, please make sure you have this chart. This is so important, definitely always on the test. Now, if you have a resistant attachment, and so what ends up happening is when the separation occurs, there's intense distress when the mother leaves. When the stranger is there, the stranger will totally be fearful of, the child will be fearful of the stranger. And even if the mom is there, or over time, they still are scared of the stranger. They tend not to interact with the stranger. As opposed to the secure attachment, they tend to be, over time, they start warming up to the stranger. Okay. In resistance, when the mom comes back, the child will approaches the mom, but there tends to be a little bit like a pushback from the child, okay? Or they're more reserved. Like you'll see that they tend to be like angry with the parents for leaving them, okay? Then what tends to happen is also that the child tends to cry more and will explore less when it's alone, as opposed to the secure child. Yes, they'll cry, but over time they start exploring and kind of feel safe in the environment. Okay, and this is about 15% of the children that they study. Now, avoidant, okay, is when the parent leaves, there's basically no sign of distress, they're fine, the mother leaves, okay, like nothing. Then when the stranger comes in, it's like the stranger, they're okay with the stranger there, and they'll play like nothing. But when the reunion is important, when the reunion, the mother comes back into the room, They show very little interest of the mom, probably even ignoring the mom. Um, and then other things you need to know is that the mother and the stranger are able to comfort the infant, okay, during this time. And then that happens about 15%. Like there's no real difference, you notice, between the mother and the stranger for the child, okay? So let's talk about these attachment styles, okay? And again, there are so many more. Like if you Google, this is like a hot thing for with when it comes to attachment in psychology. It's kind of like what a lot of people are talking about, the different attachment styles for humans, just like that love language that came out. Okay, so let's talk about the first one. The first one is the secure attachment. Okay, and when a child is in the secure attachment, they tend to be trusting. They are attuned to emotions, and I have this chart here so you guys could write that down here. I don't want it like a box here, so just write it like the bullets that we have. But this is, as you'll see here, they're trusting, they're emotionally a lot more stable, they are able to communicate effectively, they're cooperative, they're flexible as well. They tend to be a little bit more independent or exploring their environment. So they feel safe, right, in the different situations. Then you have these other three, which are the anxious, avoidant, dismissive, and avoidant, fearful. Now, these are all, so you understand, are all considered insecure attachments. Now there's just different names to it. Okay, so the anxious attachment, sorry, is when they're a lot more, they're sensitive, especially in their central nervous system. They tend to be a little like anxious children. They get nervous. They struggle in communicating not effectively, but more directly to others. And they can act out or feel jealous when they're triggered, or that insecurity of attachment is not there, or they're feeling it's being withdrawn, then they tend to act out, okay, or lash out. Then you have the next one, which is avoidant dismissive attachment. And this is where they downplay the importance of relationships. They're extremely independent or self reliant, like they don't need anybody. Relationships are not important to me. Like everybody's out to get me, or everybody's gonna hurt me. It's kind of like a way of self-preservation from getting hurt. And then of course they are more vulnerable when there is a bigger crisis. Okay. Then the last one is avoidant fearful. This is where they're actually more dependent on relationships because they're afraid of being alone. There's a lot more fear of rejection or being pushed away. They tend to be a little bit more the people pleasers. In relationships, they can have low self esteem, and there's a lot more anxiety when it comes to relationships. Okay, so obviously, we always want to secure attachment. And the reality is that a lot of these attachment styles affect our later relationships in life. And that is this next little section I want you to incorporate. So, attachment styles and how it affects your later relationships. So, you need to know that early attachments that happen as we're babies and children is what's going to form the foundation of our adult relationships, okay? And how we seek affection and comfort from these relationships, okay? And it doesn't have to be, it could be any type of relationship, from your intimate relationships to your friends, to your coworkers, to family relationships. So it could incorporate any type of relationships. Now, an adult style that is secure, it tends to be, they're trusting. There's a trusting attachment. If you have insecure or anxious attachment, you tend to be more avoidant, or anxious when it comes to relationships. Now, it affects relationships with our own children, right? As we create this attachment. Now, when we become parents, it also affects the way that we create attachment with our children. So this is why it's so important that the more we learn about these things, right, the more we change the narrative, right? We start looking at, okay, what are attachment styles that are more effective for us to have well-rounded, healthy relationships and attachments, okay? Now, you need to know a little bit about the deprivation of attachment, and I want you to write that down here, which is, or down wherever your notes are, which is the deprivation of attachment. What happens when there's no attachment? Or people that are living or have been raised, sorry for the sloppy writing, but that says attachment, when there's more abusive homes, okay, or upbringing. So one thing you need to know is that most children that are born under adversity or challenges, they tend to be actually more resilient to challenges in life. If life is too easy, sometimes it's harder for people to cope with that as they get older. Okay, so like people, like children that have had like a really easy life and no struggles, everything has been easy. What can happen is that as when they become adults and challenges get to them, or show up in their doorsteps, then they're like they don't have the tools or resilience to cope with that. Okay, so but like we all know, we are all malleable. Just because, let's say, your childhood was a certain way, it doesn't mean that you cannot still continue to take control and change the things you don't like, right? Which is the beauty of being a human being, is that constant evolution and changing, and being malleable to change, which is a beautiful thing. Okay, so children that tend to be in long abusive past or experiences, it is a lot harder for them to bounce back from that. However, and well, in addition to that, if there is constant abuse, both physical, emotional, that can also um, fall into like the person also does that. Or if they may not be, let's say, if they were emotionally abused, right? A lot of insulting, putting down. Now, they may not do that, but they will most likely seek another partner or friends that are like that as well. Like their relationships will mirror that. Okay, so it's a little bit harder for them to get out of that mold, especially people that are consistently in that abusive experience or home. Um, Typically, you would see abusive parents or even criminals, they tend to report that they were either neglected or also physically or mentally abused as well in the home. But it does not mean that every child that gets abused becomes a violent criminal or an abusive parent. There may be a correlation, but it's not a cause and effect. Okay? Now, um, you need to know as well is that extreme abuse does actually affect the brain and the brain chemistry. Especially if you're in a home that is like the child is always in that fight or flight. When we go into that fight or flight, like you guys know, those chemicals, lots of hormonal changes happen, and those will that can permanently affect the brain and its wiring. And so you'll see a higher risk or higher probability of health problems, psychological disorders, and also substance abuse or criminals, like increased criminal rate. Now, also adults that cut an attachment bond with the child due to a death or separation, it actually agitates, obviously, the child, where they're preoccupied with the loss of the parents, or even later on when they get in a relationship, they're always worried or anxious about losing a partner, or there's sadness, or there's even an emotional detachment because of the pain of losing a parent. Okay, but like always, again, always we are malleable. Psychotherapy is always great when it comes to these things. Having somebody that studies psychology giving you the proper tools to be able to deal with this. Okay, and last but not least is going to be the different temperaments. And this is a great way to see of how nature, really, it's that nature versus nurture, when it comes to how parents attach to their child. So temperament is basically how, like, our traits that we are born with, right? Every baby has a specific temperament that that has been linked to prenatal development, okay? And this is basically a person's characteristics of emotional reactivity and intensity. Okay, so it's how they're, it's very related to their central nervous system as well, of their emotional reactivity. Okay, and there are three types of uh, temperament. Okay, sorry. So I just wanted you guys to add something else, is that hereditary is, uh, it is predisposed. You're predisposed using with hereditary with these temperaments, okay? So it is a nature, right? Natural thing. It is genetics that determines our temperament, okay? So the first temperament that you need to know is called a difficult baby, or difficult. And this is the baby that tends to be irritable, they're intense and unpredictable. Okay, the second one is going to be the easy baby. Easy babies, they're cheerful, relaxed, they're a little bit more predictable in what they eat and sleep. They're just like, yay, fun to be around, right? They're easy. And then the last one is the slow to warm up. Is the slow to warm up is when they tend to be a little bit more resistant or withdrawn, and then as they get to know you, they slowly um, start, being a little bit more themselves and not so, held back. Now, you need to understand that these different temperaments are going to affect the way a parent interacts with the child. So, for instance, and there's always two ways, there's always two flipped ways of seeing this, right? So let's say I have a difficult baby, and I want you guys to write this down. If I have a difficult baby, and me as a parent, right? Maybe it's because they're sick, or they're colicky, or they're always crying. As a parent, and depending my own attachment style, I will decide, well, if I have a difficult baby, maybe I need to be a little bit more comforting, and it needs more attention. So maybe for this child, they would need more attention, and it will seem like, oh, they're always like with the child. Okay, now the flip side of that, if you have a difficult baby, maybe as a parent you could be like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be around my kid because he's stressing me out, or she's stressing me out, because it's always crying, and it just, it's harder for some parents to attach themselves to babies that are constantly crying. Because if you've ever been in a room with a crying newborn, or a little baby that can't express itself, and you've tried everything, it's really challenging, and frustrating, that you can either be really, really loving, or you may want to even fall back, than we with the child. Okay, so it's good to note that, because that can happen. Then you have the easy baby, right? And you could see it from two sides. If I have an easy baby and it's great to be around, maybe I want to spend more time with that baby. Then, but on the flip side is, if I have an easy baby, maybe I think, well, it doesn't need me as much as, as maybe a difficult baby would need me. So they may step back, and it seems like they don't care, but they're just giving you more of that independence. And then the last one is that slow to warm up. And it could be two things, like being patient and saying, okay, it needs a little bit more time. I could be patient with them, as opposed to maybe another parent that is not so patient, or is like, why don't they just be easy? Or, it's kind of like that in the fence. It's not clear, right? If the baby is easy or difficult, right? It's kind of an in between. So this is why many times, if you notice, like if you have siblings and you think, oh, my parents, their favorite child is, my brother or my sister. And I used to think that same way too, right? Because so my brother was a difficult baby, and then I was a more slow to warm up type of child. But as growing up, my brother was very difficult, and he got a lot of attention because he behaved pretty bad. So then I always thought growing up, I was like, wow, my mom must really like my brother more than me, because she was always like, oh, talking to my brother, or like giving him the attention because he really needed the attention. Because if she didn't, he would get in trouble, or he would do like crazy things. Okay, this is my brother was in kindergarten. He wanted to go on to a friend's house to go play, and he literally went on the bus with the friends, and my mom had no idea. So she thought he was like stolen. She was calling the police, and he was at a friend's house. Different times. But so that was my brother. Like he always needed eyes on him. And I was more easygoing, a little bit slow to warm up. So it was kind of like just quiet. My mom, would let me do more of my own thing because I was more independent. I didn't need so much attention, as because I wasn't doing anything bad, than my brother. So the perception, right, as a kid, you may think, oh, my parent likes that sibling better, but it just may be the simple fact of, because of their temperament, it will affect the way that the parent interacts with that child. Okay, so there you go. That is the last thing on this section.